The ink on Julian Park's skin was supposed to be a secret, a map of violence and survival hidden beneath $3,000 worth of bespoke Italian wool. But tonight the fabric felt like a cage and the secrets were clawing their way out. He stood at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of untouched whiskey warming in his grip, watching the gala swirl in a blur of diamonds and hollow laughter, while every nerve ending in his body screamed toward the one point of gravity that mattered. Zora Hayes. She was across the room, laughing at something a silver-haired investor had said, her head thrown back in a gesture of practiced ease that didn't reach her eyes. He knew that laugh. He had catalogued every variation of it over the past 6 months, from the genuine, breathless sound she made when he surprised her with rare books to the brittle, defensive tone she used when she was trying to convince herself she didn't need him. Tonight, it was the brittle one. Tonight she was performing for an audience that saw her as an acquisition, a brilliant young archivist hired to legitimize his family's tainted legacy. And Julian wanted to shatter every crystal chandelier in the room just to make her stop. His thumb traced the rim of the glass, a restless, repetitive motion that was the only outward sign of the storm consuming him from the inside. The tattoos covering his ribs, his shoulders, the thick bands wrapping around his forearms, pulsed with phantom heat, as if the ink itself remembered what his hands had done to earn it, what they were capable of doing again if the world kept pushing her away from him. He had built an empire on control, on the kind of ruthless precision that turned chaos into profit. But Zora was the variable he could never solve, the equation that rewrote itself every time she walked into a room. She shifted, adjusting the strap of her emerald gown, and his gaze locked onto the movement with predatory focus. The dress was modest by the room's standards, high-necked and long-sleeved, but he knew the landscape beneath it better than he knew the quarterly earnings reports. He knew the exact spot where her pulse fluttered when she was anxious, the way her skin warmed under his touch, the soft exhale she tried to suppress when he leaned too close. Memory was a torment. It played behind his eyelids in relentless loops. Her fingers tangled in his hair, her whispered confessions in the dark, the way she had looked at him last Tuesday when he'd crossed a line she hadn't known existed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hunger that had nearly undone him. He had pulled back then. He always pulled back, because Julian Park did not get to want things. He got to acquire them, manage them, dispose of them when they ceased to be useful. Wanting was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities got people killed in the world he came from. But Zora wasn't a thing. She was a person who had somehow slipped past every defense he'd spent 28 years constructing. And now she was standing 30 feet away, smiling at a man who didn't deserve the air she breathed, and Julian's restraint was fraying thread by thread. A waiter passed with a tray of champagne. Julian declined without looking. His entire awareness was tethered to her. An invisible cord pulled taut across the polished marble floor. He watched the investor lean in too close, saw Zora's shoulder tense almost imperceptibly, and something ancient and territorial uncoiled in his chest. It wasn't jealousy. Jealousy implied uncertainty. This was certainty. This was the bone-deep knowledge that she was his to protect, his to cherish, his to ruin if he wasn't careful. The duality was exhausting. He wanted to cross the room and claim her in front of everyone, press his mouth to hers until the false laugh dissolved into the real one, let the world see what belonged to him. He also wanted to disappear, to remove himself from her orbit entirely so she could have the safe, ordinary life she deserved, the one he could never provide. The conflict lived in the space between heartbeats, in the suffocating silence that filled his lungs whenever she was near. She glanced up then, as if feeling the weight of his stare, and their eyes met across the glittering expanse. Time didn't stop. That was a cliché for lesser emotions. Instead, time accelerated, compressing everything into a single, devastating moment of recognition. Her smile faltered. Just for a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, and he saw the raw truth underneath. She was tired. She was lonely. She was wondering if he would ever stop holding himself back. The question hung between them, heavy as smoke, and Julian felt it settle in his marrow. He set the whiskey down on a passing tray without breaking eye contact. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath the skin. The crowd faded to static. There was only her, the emerald silk catching the light, the pulse visible at the base of her throat, the unspoken plea in her dark eyes that matched the one screaming inside his own skull. He took a step forward, then another. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, a masterclass in contained devastation. People parted for him without being asked, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure, the gravitational pull of a man who had decided to stop pretending. Zora didn't move. She couldn't. He saw the hitch in her breath, the way her fingers curled against the stem of her champagne flute, the dilation of her pupils as he closed the distance. This was the moment, the precipice. Everything before had been prologue. Everything after would be consequence. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice whispered that anyone listening to this story right now knows exactly what it feels like to stand on that edge, to feel the magnetic pull of someone who is both your salvation and your destruction. And if you've ever been there, if you've ever loved someone so completely it terrified you, then you understand why what happens next cannot be stopped. You understand why you need to stay, why you need to witness this, why you need to subscribe and follow this journey to its end. Because stories like this don't come along often, and neither do moments like this, suspended between ruin and redemption, waiting for someone brave enough to fall. Julian stopped 2 feet from her, close enough to smell her perfume, jasmine and something warmer, something uniquely hers, close enough to see the individual flecks of gold in her irises, close enough to destroy them both. "You're leaving," he said, not a question, a statement, command wrapped in velvet. His voice was low, roughened by hours of silence and years of suppression, and it vibrated through the space between them like a struck bell. Zora's lips parted. No sound emerged. She didn't need to speak. Her body answered for her, leaning infinitesimally toward him, drawn by the same inexorable force that had brought him across the room. The investor cleared his throat awkwardly, sensing the exclusion, and melted away. They were alone in a sea of people. Julian reached out, slow, giving her every opportunity to pull back, and brushed his knuckles against the bare skin of her wrist where the glove ended. The contact was electric. A spark jumped between them, visible only to those who knew how to look. Zora's breath caught audibly. Her gaze dropped to his hand, then rose to his face, searching. What she found there made her swallow hard. "Julian," she whispered, his name a prayer and a warning. He stepped closer. The world narrowed to the space between their bodies, to the heat radiating off his skin, to the intricate patterns of ink barely concealed by his cuff, to the promise and the peril written in the lines of his face. "I'm done pretending," he murmured, his forehead nearly touching hers. His voice meant only for her, a vow spoken in the language of surrender. "I'm done watching you pretend." Her eyes glistened, not with tears, with recognition, with the terrifying, beautiful acknowledgement that they had both been waiting for this moment since the first time their hands had accidentally touched over an ancient manuscript in the archives, since the first time he'd stayed late to help her catalog, since the first time she'd looked at him and seen not the billionaire heir but the man beneath the armor. The tension was unbearable, sweet, agonizing, the kind of tension that exists only when 2 people have circled each other for months, building walls and dismantling them in equal measure, and finally, the walls are gone. Julian's free hand came up to cradle her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that belied the violence coiled in his frame. She leaned into the touch instinctively, her eyes fluttering shut for just a moment, and in that moment he memorized the weight of her trust. When she opened her eyes again, the ballroom was gone. The investors, the champagne, the performance, all of it had ceased to exist. There was only this. His hand on her face, her breath mingling with his, the unspoken understanding that whatever happened next would change everything. He tilted her chin up. She rose to meet him. The gap between them closed. And then the heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with a crash that shattered the spell like glass. Security flooded in, earpieces crackling, faces grim. Julian's head snapped toward the disturbance, his body instantly shifting from lover to protector, his arm wrapping around Zora's waist and pulling her flush against him in one fluid motion. The tenderness vanished. In its place was something cold and lethal, the full weight of the Park family legacy descending like a blade. Zora felt the transformation against her skin, the hardening of muscle, the shift in his breathing. She didn't pull away. She pressed closer, anchoring herself to him as chaos erupted around them. Because she understood, even now, even in this fractured moment, that the man holding her was both the shelter and the storm. And she had chosen him anyway. The lead security officer approached, his expression tight with urgency. "Sir, we have a situation." Julian didn't release Zora. His gaze remained fixed on the officer, but his hold on her waist tightened possessively, a silent declaration that whatever was coming, she was not leaving his side. "Speak," he commanded, his voice stripped of all warmth, all trace of the man who had been seconds away from kissing her. The officer hesitated, glancing at Zora. Julian's eyes narrowed. "She stays. Whatever you have to say, you say it in front of her." The officer nodded once, accepting the terms. "Your brother has been found. He's alive, but he's asking for Ms. Hayes specifically. He says she's the only one who knows where the ledger is." Zora went rigid against Julian's side. The color drained from her face. Julian felt it, the sudden tremor running through her frame, and his grip became iron. His brother, Taejin. The name was a wound that never healed, a ghost that haunted every success, every failure, every sleepless night. And now Taejin was asking for Zora, for her. The implications cascaded through Julian's mind like dominoes falling in slow motion. The ledger, the missing account records that had plagued the family for years. The reason Taejin had disappeared. The reason Julian had inherited an empire built on secrets. And Zora knew. She had known. All along. He looked down at her, really looked at her, and saw the guilt written in the lines of her face, the shame, the fear. She hadn't told him. She had carried this burden in silence, smiled at galas, laughed at jokes, let him touch her and want her and almost kiss her, all while holding the key to his family's darkest mystery. Betrayal tasted like copper on his tongue. But beneath it, deeper and more powerful, was something else. Understanding, because he recognized that look. He had worn it himself for years. The look of someone protecting the people they love from truths that would destroy them. He drew her closer, shielding her from the stares of the security team, from the whispers already starting to ripple through the crowd. His lips brushed her temple, a gesture so intimate, so protective, that the security officer looked away. "Whatever you've done," he breathed against her skin, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't name. "We'll face it together." Zora's hand came up to grip his lapel, her fingers twisting in the expensive fabric. She nodded, unable to speak, and in that nod was everything. Apology, gratitude, terror, love. The kind of love that survives betrayal. The kind that chooses to stay even when staying costs everything. Julian lifted his head. His expression was stone. His eyes were fire. "Bring the car," he said to the officer, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And tell my brother I'm coming. Tell him I'm bringing her. And tell him if he's harmed a single hair on her head, blood won't be enough to pay the debt." They moved through the parting crowd like a single entity, his arm around her waist, her hand fisted in his jacket. Two people bound by secrets and desire, and the terrible, beautiful weight of choosing each other in a world designed to keep them apart. The ballroom doors closed behind them, sealing away the glittering facade. Ahead lay darkness, truth, and the reckoning they had both been running toward since the beginning. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the charged silence of the elevator descending toward the garage, Julian's hand found hers in the dark. Their fingers intertwined. A tether, an anchor, promise whispered without words. Whatever came next, they would face it as they had faced everything else. Together, terrified, and utterly, devastatingly alive. The elevator descent was a silent plunge into the earth. The polished steel walls reflecting two figures pressed so close together that the boundaries between them had begun to blur. Julian didn't speak. He couldn't. The revelation about the ledger had rewritten the entire architecture of his relationship with Zora in a single brutal instant. and he needed the silence to rebuild his understanding of her from the ground up. She stood beside him, her hands still locked in his, her breathing shallow and controlled in the way he recognized as professional composure masking personal devastation. He felt the tremor in her fingers, the minute adjustments she made to keep from collapsing against him, and every instinct screamed at him to pull her into his arms and absorb the shaking into his own body. But he held back, not because he didn't want to, because she needed him to be steady right now, not tender. She needed the man who could walk into whatever hell awaited them and bring her back out. The elevator chimed softly. The doors slid open to reveal the private garage, sleek and empty except for the black sedan idling near the exit. Julian guided her toward it without breaking physical contact, his hands sliding from hers to the small of her back, a possessive pressure that communicated everything he couldn't say aloud. Asterisk, I have you. I'm here. You're safe. Asterisk, the driver opened the rear door, took one look at Julian's expression, and retreated to the front seat without a word. Julian settled Zora into the leather interior first, then slid in beside her, pulling the door shut behind them. The moment the latch clicked, the air changed. They were sealed in, alone. The partition between front and back seats was already raised, tinted glass ensuring their privacy. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by the amber glow of streetlights passing outside. Zora turned to face him. In the dimness, her eyes were enormous, luminous with unshed tears and something fiercer, something that looked like defiance warring with shame. I should have told you, she whispered, her voice raw. Months ago, when I found it. Julian studied her face, memorizing the play of shadow and light across her features. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, slow, deliberate, anchoring her to the present moment. Why didn't you? The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuine. He needed to understand the shape of her silence, the weight she'd carried alone. Zora swallowed hard. Her gaze dropped to his chest, to the place where his tattoos lay hidden beneath fabric. Because I knew what it would cost you, your family, your name, everything you've built. She met his eyes again, and the vulnerability in hers was staggering. I thought I could find a way to fix it before you ever had to know, before it could hurt you. The confession hung between them, fragile as glass. Julian felt something crack wide open in his chest. She hadn't betrayed him. She had been trying to save him. In her own way, with her own tools, in the quiet hours when he thought she was merely working late in the archives. She had been fighting a war he hadn't even known existed. The realization was humbling, devastating, beautiful. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them until their foreheads nearly touched. His breath mingled with hers, warm and uneven. Zora. Her name was a benediction, a surrender. You don't get to protect me from my own family's sins. His voice was rough, stripped bare. You don't get to carry that weight alone. Not anymore. Her lower lip trembled. Just once. Then she nodded, and the movement was so small, so trusting, that Julian felt it land somewhere permanent inside him. He brought his hand up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the soft curls at her nape, holding her there, keeping her present, keeping her his. Tell me everything, he murmured. Not later, now, while we're moving, while no one can interrupt us. Give me the truth, Zora. All of it. And she did. In the darkness of the speeding car, with his hand anchored at her neck and his presence wrapping around her like armor, she spoke. She told him about the hidden compartment in the archive vault, about the leather-bound book she'd found misfiled behind a row of tax records, about the entries detailing offshore accounts, shell companies, payments to officials whose names he recognized from news headlines, about Taejean's handwriting in the margins, frantic and increasingly erratic, about the night she'd realized the ledger wasn't just evidence of corruption. It was a map of her brother-in-law's descent, a record of how deeply he'd been compromised, how desperately he'd tried to extract himself and failed. She spoke without embellishment, without self-pity, her voice steady despite the tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Julian listened, truly listened, not as a CEO assessing damage, not as a brother calculating betrayal, but as a man receiving the most precious gift anyone had ever offered him, her complete, unvarnished trust. He absorbed every word, every pause, every hitch in her breath. He cataloged the details not for strategy but for intimacy, weaving them into the tapestry of who she was, who they were becoming. When she finished, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, saturated with everything they had survived to reach this moment. Julian wiped the tears from her face with his thumb, his touch infinitely gentle against the contrast of his inked knuckles. "Thank you," he breathed. 2 words, a universe of meaning. Zora leaned into his palm, her eyes closing briefly, and in that gesture was absolution. Not because she needed it, because he needed to give it. The car slowed. They were approaching the outskirts of the city, the glittering skyline giving way to industrial warehouses and forgotten stretches of coastline. This was where Taejin had asked to meet, where the past waited to be confronted. Julian felt Zora tense beside him, felt the fear radiating off her in waves. He shifted closer, his arms sliding around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. She came willingly, her head resting against his chest, her ear positioned over his heart. He felt her listening to its rhythm, matching her breathing to its cadence, using his heartbeat as a metronome for her courage. "Whatever happens in there," he said, his voice low and certain, vibrating through his chest and into hers. "You are not leaving my side. You are not facing him alone. You are mine to protect, Zora. Do you understand?" She tilted her head up to look at him. In the passing streetlight, her expression was fierce, resolved. "I understand." 3 words. A vow. The car stopped. The engine cut. Silence rushed in, heavy with anticipation. Beyond the tinted windows, a warehouse loomed, its corrugated metal walls scarred with rust and graffiti. A single light burned above a side entrance. No guards visible. No vehicles besides theirs. It was exactly the kind of isolated, vulnerable location that should have triggered every security protocol Julian had ever established. Instead, it triggered something older, something primal. The need to walk into danger with the person who mattered most and emerge intact. He opened the door. Cool night air flooded in, carrying the scent of salt and oil and decay. Julian stepped out first, then turned to offer Zora his hand. She took it. Her grip was firm, steady. Together, they walked toward the light. Each step was synchronized, their bodies moving in unconscious harmony. 2 people who had learned to navigate darkness by relying on each other's strength. The side door was unlocked. Julian pushed it open with his free hand, keeping Zora tucked against his side, his body angled to shield hers. Inside, the warehouse was cavernous and dimly lit, concrete floors stretching into shadow. In the center of the space, beneath the single hanging bulb, sat a folding chair. And in the chair sat Taejin Park. He was thinner than Julian remembered. Gaunt. His hair was longer, unkempt, his clothes worn and stained. But his eyes were the same, dark, intelligent, haunted by ghosts that had never left. He looked up as they entered, and his gaze went straight to Zora. Not to Julian, to her. A flicker of something crossed his face. Relief, regret, recognition. "You came," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Both of you." Julian stopped 10 feet away, keeping Zora partially behind him, his stance protective without being aggressive. "You asked for her," he said, his tone level, controlled. "She's here. Now tell us why." Taejin's eyes stayed fixed on Zora. "Because she's the only one who read it. The only one who understands what I was trying to do." He swallowed hard. "I didn't steal from the family, Julian. I was trying to stop someone else from stealing everything." The words landed like stones in still water. Julian felt Zora stiffen beside him, felt the sharp intake of her breath. She had suspected, had hoped, but hearing it confirmed, from Taejin's own mouth, was different. It rearranged the narrative she'd constructed in solitude. "Who?" Julian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Taejin's gaze finally shifted to him. The brothers stared at each other across the gulf of years and silence and misunderstanding. Uncle Minsuk, Taejin said. He's been siphoning funds for decades, building his own empire inside ours. The ledger isn't proof of my crimes, Julian. It's proof of his. The name hit Julian like a physical blow. Minsuk, his father's younger brother. The man who had smiled at family gatherings, who had praised Julian's achievements, who had attended his mother's funeral with appropriate grief. The man Julian had trusted. The betrayal was so vast, so intimate, that for a moment Julian couldn't breathe. He felt Zora's hand tighten on his arm, felt her stepping forward slightly, positioning herself beside him rather than behind him, supporting him, anchoring him. "We have copies," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the tremor underneath. "Digital backups, encrypted, stored in 3 separate locations." Taejin's shoulders sagged. Visible relief washed over his face. "Then it's not too late." Julian found his voice, found his footing. "It's never too late to burn a traitor to the ground." The words were cold, final, but beneath them burned something hotter. Gratitude. For Zora. For her foresight, her courage, her refusal to let the truth die in silence. He glanced at her, and in that glance was everything he couldn't say in front of his brother. Pride, love, awe. Taejin saw it. Saw the way Julian looked at her, the way she stood beside him as an equal, as a partner. Something softened in his expression. "She saved us both," he murmured. Julian didn't correct him, because it was true. The 3 of them stood in the dim warehouse, bound by blood and choice and the terrible, beautiful weight of truth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the metal walls. Inside, something shifted, settled. The reckoning had begun, and they would face it together. If you've ever stood in the wreckage of a broken trust and chosen to rebuild anyway, if you've ever loved someone enough to carry their secrets as your own, then you know this moment isn't fiction. It's recognition. And if the story has found you, if it's speaking to something living inside your chest, then stay. Subscribe. Let this journey continue, because what comes next will test everything they've built, and you deserve to witness how love survives the fire. Julian turned to Zora. His hand found hers in the dimness, their fingers intertwined. A tether, an anchor, a promise renewed in the face of everything that sought to break them. "Let's go home," he whispered. And for the first time in years, home wasn't a place. It was her. The drive back to the penthouse was a study in suspended animation. The city lights streaking past the tinted windows like comets in a private universe where only 3 people existed. Taejin sat in the front seat, separated by the partition but no longer a ghost. His presence a heavy, tangible weight that reshaped the air in the car. Julian hadn't released Zora's hand since they'd left the warehouse. Their fingers remained laced together on the leather seat between them, a silent circuit of reassurance that pulsed with every mile. She could feel the tension still coiled in his forearm, the residual adrenaline that hadn't yet metabolized into calm. But beneath it was something steadier, deeper, relief. Not the brittle relief of crisis averted, but the profound, bone-settling relief of truth finally spoken. She leaned her head against his shoulder, not asking for permission, simply taking the space she now knew was hers. He shifted instantly, adjusting his posture to better support her weight, his cheek resting briefly against the crown of her head. The gesture was so automatic, so ingrained, that it spoke louder than any declaration. They had crossed a threshold. The secrets were out. The alliances were redrawn. And in the aftermath, what remained was clearer than it had ever been. When the elevator doors opened onto the penthouse foyer, Julian guided her inside with a hand at her waist, his touch firm and proprietary. Taejin followed, moving through the space like a man relearning how to inhabit his own life. Julian paused in the entryway, turning to his brother. "Guest suite is prepared. Rest. We'll strategize at dawn." His tone was gentle but firm, the voice of a man reclaiming his role as protector without diminishing the autonomy of the person he was protecting. Taejin nodded, his eyes meeting Zora's briefly. In that look was gratitude so raw it nearly buckled her knees. Then he was gone, disappearing down the hall, leaving Julian and Zora alone in the vast, quiet expanse of the living room. The silence that settled around them wasn't empty. It was saturated, heavy with everything unsaid, everything newly understood, everything that had shifted irrevocably in the span of 6 hours. Julian turned to face her fully. His gaze swept over her, cataloging, assessing, confirming she was whole. His hand came up to brush a stray curl from her forehead, his knuckles grazing her skin with infinite care. "You're trembling," he murmured. She hadn't realized she was. The adrenaline was ebbing, leaving exhaustion and vulnerability in its wake. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. "I'm okay," she whispered, "just feeling it all." He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them. His other arm slid around her waist, drawing her flush against him. She could feel the hard planes of his chest, the steady rhythm of his heart, the heat radiating through layers of fabric. "Feel it," he breathed against her temple. "Don't hold it back. Not with me." The permission undid her. A sob escaped, soft and broken, and then another, and suddenly she was crying against his chest, her hands fisted in his shirt, her body shaking with the release of months of solitary burden. Julian held her, didn't shush her, didn't try to fix it, just anchored her through the storm, his arms a fortress, his heartbeat a drum against her ear, his chin resting atop her head as if he could physically shield her from the aftershocks. He absorbed every tremor, every gasp, every tear soaking into his expensive shirt, and in his stillness was a devotion so complete it felt sacred. When the sobs finally subsided into hitches of breath, he tilted her chin up. His thumb wiped the wetness from her cheeks, his expression tender and fierce. "You carried this alone for too long," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Never again." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the quiet. "I need you to understand something," he whispered. "What happened tonight doesn't change how I see you. Clarifies it. You are not the ledger. You are not the secret. You are the woman who protected my family when I couldn't. You are the reason we still have a chance." His words settled into her bones, rewriting the narrative of shame she'd constructed. She rose onto her toes, closing the final distance between them, and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't the desperate, claiming kiss of the ballroom. It was slower, deeper, a homecoming. His arms tightened around her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other splayed across her lower back, holding her as if she were something precious and permanent. The kiss deepened, becoming a conversation without words, a mutual surrender to the truth of what they were. The rest of the world ceased to exist as his mouth moved against hers, tasting salt and jasmine and promise, until the heavy oak door of the master suite clicked shut behind them, sealing them in their own private universe. The next morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling curtains, painting golden stripes across white silk sheets. Zora woke tangled in them, her body warm and heavy with sleep, the scent of sandalwood and ink lingering on the pillow beside her. Julian was already awake, propped against the headboard, watching her with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that it stole her breath. His shirt was discarded somewhere, revealing the full canvas of his tattoos. Intricate geometric patterns flowing across his shoulders, down his ribs, wrapping around his forearms like armor made of art. In the morning light, they weren't hidden. They were honored. She reached out, tracing a line of ink along his collarbone. He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm, and held it against his chest, right over his heart. "Stay," he murmured, not a command, a request. She smiled, the first genuine, unburdened smile she'd worn in months. "I'm not going anywhere." But peace, she would learn, was not the absence of conflict. It was the presence of readiness. By noon, Julian's phone began to vibrate with encrypted messages. Minsuk had learned of Taejin's return, had learned of the ledger's existence, had begun to move. Julian stood at the window, phone in hand, his silhouette sharp against the skyline. Zora watched him from the bed, recognizing the shift in his posture, the return of the strategist, the warrior. He turned to her, his expression grim but resolved. He's calling an emergency board meeting tomorrow, trying to consolidate power before we can act. She sat up, the sheets pooling around her waist. Then we act today. He crossed the room, sitting on the edge of the bed, taking both her hands in his. This will get ugly. He has allies, resources. He'll try to discredit you, to paint you as a manipulator, a gold digger, a liability. His jaw tightened. I won't let him. I know, she said softly. But I won't hide behind you either. I found that ledger. I understand its contents better than anyone. Let me stand beside you. Not behind you. Beside you. He studied her face, searching for doubt, for fear, finding none. Only certainty. Slowly he nodded. Beside me, he echoed. The words were a vow, a restructuring of power, a recognition that she was not merely his heart, but his equal in the war to come. They spent the afternoon in his study, surrounded by screens and documents, building their case. Zora's archival training proved invaluable. She cross-referenced entries, identified patterns, connected dots Julian's financial analysts had missed. He watched her work with undisguised admiration, his pride a palpable force in the room. At one point, frustrated by a missing link, she muttered under her breath, and he leaned over her shoulder, his chest pressing against her back, his arm reaching past hers to highlight a discrepancy on the screen. The intimacy of collaboration was intoxicating. Their minds worked in tandem, their bodies aligned, their purpose singular. When she solved the puzzle, turning to him with triumph shining in her eyes, he didn't congratulate her. He kissed her, quick, hard, possessive, a celebration of her brilliance. God, you're magnificent. He breathed against her lips. The words weren't flattery. They were fact. And in that moment, Zora understood that being loved by Julian Park wasn't about being cherished despite her competence. It was about being cherished because of it. Evening fell. The city lights blinked on below. They stood side by side at the window, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, his chin resting on her shoulder. Below them, the empire stretched, glittering and vulnerable. Ahead of them lay battle. But here, in this space, they were unshakable. Are you afraid? He asked quietly. She considered the question, felt the weight of it. Yes, she admitted. But not of him, of losing this, us. His arms tightened. You won't. His voice was absolute. We've survived worse than ambition. We've survived silence. We've survived lies. Truth is our foundation now. Nothing can crack it. She turned in his arms, facing him, her hands framing his face. Then let's go to war. The words hung between them, charged with purpose and passion. He covered her hands with his own, his tattoos stark against her skin, a visual testament to the duality he embodied. Violence and tenderness, power and surrender, destruction and creation. Together, he affirmed. And in that word was everything. If you've ever chosen to fight for love not in spite of the cost but because the cost proves its worth, if you've ever stood beside someone and known that together you are more formidable than apart, then this moment belongs to you. Stay. Subscribe. Because tomorrow's boardroom will test everything they've built, and you deserve to see how truth wages war against deception. The night deepened. They didn't sleep. They prepared. Not just with strategy but with presence, with touch, with whispered confessions and shared silences, with the quiet, relentless reinforcement of their bond. Because they understood with cellular certainty that the battle ahead would demand everything. And they intended to give it. Everything. Together. The boardroom of Shin Industries was a cathedral of glass and steel suspended 60 stories above the city, designed to make anyone who entered feel small, temporary, and utterly at the mercy of the power that resided within its walls. But when Julian Park pushed through the double doors with Zora Hayes at his side, the architecture seemed to bow. He wore a charcoal suit cut sharp enough to draw blood. His tie knotted with military precision, but the cuffs were deliberately left unbuttoned, revealing the intricate bands of ink wrapping around his wrists. A statement, a warning. He was not here to perform respectability. He was here to dismantle a lie. Zora walked beside him, not behind, her spine straight, her gaze level, wearing a tailored navy dress that projected authority without apology. She carried a slim leather portfolio containing the digital evidence they had spent the night fortifying, and her presence in this room was itself an act of defiance against every expectation Minsuk had ever harbored about her place in Julian's world. The 12 members of the board sat around the obsidian table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled hostility. At the head of the table sat Minsuk Park, his silver hair immaculate, his smile practiced and warm, the perfect picture of avuncular concern. But Julian saw the calculation beneath it, the predatory stillness of a man who believed he had already won. "Julian," Minsuk said, rising smoothly, his voice rich with manufactured affection. "And Ms. Hayes, how unexpected." The pause before Zora's name was deliberate, a microscopic insult designed to signal her irrelevance. Julian didn't sit. He remained standing, one hand resting lightly on the back of the chair at his right, his body angled toward Zora in unconscious protection. "Uncle," he replied, his tone glacial. "You called this meeting to address concerns about financial irregularities. We're here to resolve them." Minsuk's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flickered to Zora, then back to Julian, assessing, recalibrating. "Of course, though I must say, bringing your companion to a confidential board proceeding is highly irregular. Perhaps she could wait outside while we discuss family business." The word companion landed like a slap. Zora felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. She'd expected this, had prepared for it. Before Julian could respond, she stepped forward, placing her portfolio on the table with a soft, decisive thud. "Mr. Park," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "I'm not here as Julian's companion. I'm here as the lead archivist who discovered the discrepancies in question, and as the custodian of the primary source documentation. My presence isn't irregular. It's essential." She met Minsuk's gaze directly, refusing to blink, refusing to shrink. In that moment, she wasn't defending her right to be in the room. She was asserting her ownership of the truth. Minsuk's smile finally cracked, just at the edges. Julian watched the exchange with fierce pride burning in his chest, his silence more powerful than any interjection. He let her stand in her power, let the board see her as she was, indispensable. Minsuk recovered quickly, gesturing to the empty chairs. "Please, sit. Let us hear what you've found." They sat, Julian close enough that their knees nearly touched beneath the table, a hidden point of contact that grounded them both. Zora opened the portfolio. What followed was a masterclass in controlled devastation. She presented the evidence not as accusation, but as archival fact. Dates, transactions, signatures, shell company registrations cross-referenced with internal memos. She spoke with the calm authority of someone who had lived inside these documents for months, who understood their contours better than the men who had created them. She didn't editorialize, didn't speculate, let the data speak its own damning language. With each revelation, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Board members exchanged glances. Pens stopped moving. The air grew thick with the weight of implication. Minsuk listened, his expression increasingly strained, his fingers tightening around his pen until his knuckles whitened. When Zora reached the final document, a transfer authorization bearing Minsuk's forged signature dated 3 weeks prior, he finally interrupted. "This is fabricated," he said, his voice tight. "Ms. Hayes has clearly been manipulated. Or worse, she's acting on behalf of external interests seeking to destabilize this company." He turned to Julian, his tone shifting to paternal concern. "Nephew, I understand your attachment, but you're being used. This woman has compromised you, compromised us all." The attack was predictable, crude. Julian had been waiting for it. He leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, his tattoos visible now, stark against the polished obsidian. His voice was low, dangerous, vibrating with restrained fury. "Uncle, You just accused the woman I intend to marry of fraud in front of this board. The words landed like detonations. Zora's breath caught. She hadn't known, hadn't dared hope. The board erupted in whispers. Minsuk went pale. Julian continued, his gaze never leaving his uncle's face. Every document Ms. Hayes has presented has been verified by 3 independent forensic accounting firms. Every transaction has been traced. Every signature authenticated. The only fabrication in this room is the narrative you've constructed to protect yourself. He paused, letting the silence amplify his next words. You mistook her integrity for vulnerability. You mistook my love for weakness. Both errors will cost you everything. He stood, pulling Zora up with him, his hand finding hers beneath the table, lacing their fingers together in full view of everyone. This meeting is adjourned. Security will escort you to your office, Uncle, where you will remain until federal investigators arrive. Your assets are frozen effective immediately. Your voting rights are suspended. Your name will be removed from this company before sunset. The pronouncements were absolute, final. Minsuk opened his mouth to protest, but the security team was already moving, their presence silent and immovable. As he was led from the room, his eyes met Zora's one last time. In them was not remorse, but recognition. He had underestimated her, and it had destroyed him. The board members filed out in stunned silence, casting glances at Julian and Zora that ranged from awe to apprehension. When the doors closed, leaving them alone in the vast, sunlit space, the tension broke. Julian turned to her, his expression raw, stripped of all performance. I should have told you sooner, he whispered. About marrying you. I wanted to ask properly. With rings. With time. But I couldn't let him diminish you for one more second. Zora rose onto her toes, her hands framing his face, her thumbs tracing the line of his jaw. You asked me perfectly, she murmured. In the only way that mattered. She kissed him, right there in the boardroom where empires were built and broken. A kiss that tasted of victory and vow, of battle won and future claimed. His arms wrapped around her, lifting her slightly off the ground, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had just shifted on its axis. When they finally parted, foreheads resting together, breathing the same air, Julian whispered against her lips, Marry me, not because I need you to legitimize anything, because I cannot imagine existing in a world where you are not mine. Tears pricked her eyes, not from sadness, from the overwhelming recognition of being seen, chosen, cherished in totality. Yes, she breathed. 1,000 times yes. If you've ever waited for someone to choose you loudly, publicly, irrevocably, if you've ever loved someone enough to stand beside them in the wreckage and call it home, then this moment is yours. Stay, subscribe, because the proposal was only the beginning, and the life they build from this ashes will test whether love can truly rewrite legacy. They walked out of the building hand in hand, into the blinding afternoon sun, into the uncertain, beautiful terrain of what came next. Behind them, an empire had been cleansed. Ahead of them, a future waited to be written. Together, always together. The weeks following the boardroom coup were not the peaceful denouement that fairy tales promised, but a grueling, exhilarating reconstruction of everything Julian Park had ever known. Zora stood at the center of that reconstruction, not as a figurehead or a trophy, but as the architect of a new legacy. They worked side by side in the penthouse study long after midnight, surrounded by legal briefs and restructuring plans, their intimacy woven into the fabric of their labor. He would pause mid-sentence to press a kiss to her temple when she solved a particularly thorny compliance issue. She would trace the ink on his forearm when he grew frustrated with bureaucratic resistance, her touch a silent reminder that his worth was not tied to his productivity. The engagement ring sat on her finger, a simple band of platinum etched with coordinates, the location of the archive vault where she'd found the ledger, where their true partnership had begun. It was unconventional, perfect, a testament to the fact that their love had been forged in truth, not fantasy. But healing was not linear. Taejeon's reintegration was a slow, painful process marked by therapy sessions and strained family dinners where old wounds surfaced unexpectedly. Julian bore witness to his brother's grief without trying to fix it, learning to sit in discomfort rather than command solutions. Zora became Tae-jin's quiet ally, sharing archival research techniques that gave him purpose, helping him rebuild an identity beyond the shadow of betrayal. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace watching the city lights flicker to life, Tae-jin turned to Zora and said softly, "You didn't just save the company. You saved us from becoming monsters." The words settled over them like benediction. Julian reached for Zora's hand beneath the table, his thumb brushing her knuckles, his silence speaking volumes. In that moment, the three of them were no longer defined by what had been broken, but by what they were choosing to build. Yet even as stability returned, a new tension began to hum beneath the surface. Not of danger, but of transformation. Julian found himself watching Zora during meetings, noting how naturally she commanded respect, how effortlessly she navigated spaces that had once excluded women like her. Pride swelled in his chest, fierce and bright, but alongside it came a quieter realization. She was outgrowing the role he'd initially imagined for her. Not diminishing, expanding. And expansion required space. Space he wasn't sure he knew how to give without feeling like he was losing her. The conflict came to a head on a rainy Tuesday when Zora received an offer to lead a prestigious international archival preservation initiative based in London. She hadn't applied. They'd sought her out because of her work on the Shin Industries case, which had become a landmark example of ethical corporate restitution. She held the letter in her hands as Julian entered the study, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more complex as he read the implications in her posture. "London," he said, his voice carefully neutral. She nodded, her gaze steady but vulnerable. 6 months. Maybe a year. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken fears. He wanted to ask her to stay, wanted to remind her of the wedding plans, the home they were building, the empire they were reshaping together. But he also remembered the woman who had carried secrets alone to protect him, who had stood beside him in the boardroom not because she needed his validation but because she believed in their shared truth. To ask her to shrink herself now would be a betrayal of everything they'd fought for. He crossed the room, taking the letter from her hands and setting it aside, then cupping her face in his palms. His tattoos pressed against her skin, warm and familiar. "Tell me what you want," he whispered. "Not what you think I need you to want. Not what feels safe or convenient or expected. What do you want, Zora?" Her eyes glistened. "I want to go, and I want to come back to you. Both things are true." He closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the duality, the beautiful, terrifying complexity of loving someone whole. When he opened them, his resolve was absolute. "Then you'll go." Relief and gratitude flooded her expression. He continued, his voice rough with emotion. "And I'll be here, not waiting passively, building, growing, so that when you return, we're both larger than when you left." She rose onto her toes, pressing her forehead to his. "What if we change too much?" He smiled, small and certain. "We've already changed. That's the point. Love isn't preservation, Zora. It's evolution." The kiss that followed was different from all the others. Less about claiming, more about releasing. About trusting that what they built was strong enough to stretch across oceans and time zones. If you've ever loved someone enough to let them grow beyond your grasp, if you've ever chosen faith over fear in the face of uncertainty, then this moment belongs to you. Stay. Subscribe. Because the distance will test whether their foundation can hold, and the reunion will reveal whether love truly makes people bigger, not smaller. In the days before her departure, they moved through the penthouse like ghosts of their future selves, memorizing each other's rhythms one last time before the rhythm changed. He packed her suitcase with meticulous care, folding sweaters she'd never worn, tucking notes into pockets she'd discover thousands of miles away. She left behind a scarf that smelled of jasmine, draped over his desk chair, a tangible anchor in the space she'd temporarily vacated. At the airport, they didn't cling, didn't make grand declarations. Just stood close, foreheads touching, breathing the same air one last time before the world pulled them apart. "Come back to me," he murmured against her skin. "Always," she whispered back, and as she walked toward security, she didn't look back. Not because she didn't want to, because she trusted that he'd still be there when she returned. Julian watched her disappear into the terminal, his heart aching and expanding simultaneously. Then he turned and walked back into the rain, into the work, into the becoming. Alone but not lonely, anchored even in absence, because some loves don't diminish with distance. They deepen, they transform, they endure. The silence in the penthouse was not empty. It was a physical weight, a dense and textured absence that Julian wore like a second skin. For the first 3 days after Zora's departure, he moved through the rooms with the mechanical precision of a man operating on muscle memory alone. His body present, but his consciousness tethered to a time zone 8 hours ahead. He found himself pausing in doorways, half expecting to see her silhouette against the window, or reaching for a hand that wasn't there when he poured coffee at dawn. The grief was not sharp. It was a low, constant hum, the frequency of a life temporarily out of alignment. But he had promised her evolution, not stagnation, and so he channeled the ache into action. He restructured his mornings, replacing the quiet intimacy of shared breakfasts with solitary runs along the coast. The rhythmic pounding of his feet against pavement becoming a meditation on endurance. He returned to the archives, not as a CEO overseeing a project, but as a student of Zora's methodology, spending hours in the vault she had transformed, tracing the organizational systems she'd implemented, learning to see the company's history through her eyes. It was an act of devotion disguised as diligence, a way of keeping her present even in her absence. Teijin noticed, one evening, finding Julian in the archive surrounded by century-old ledgers. His brother leaned against the doorframe and said quietly, "You're not just maintaining her work, you're inhabiting it." Julian didn't look up. "She taught me that preservation isn't passive. It's active love." The words hung in the climate-controlled air, true and heavy. Across the ocean, Zora was undergoing her own metamorphosis. London was a city of rain and stone and relentless intellectual rigor, and she threw herself into its rhythms with the same focused intensity she'd brought to Shin Industries. She led teams of archivists twice her age, earning their respect not through authority but through competence and empathy. She navigated bureaucratic labyrinths and cultural nuances with a grace that surprised even herself, discovering reserves of confidence she hadn't known she possessed. Yet in the quiet moments, alone in her rented flat, the gray light filtering through tall windows, the space beside her felt vast. She would reach for her phone, then stop herself, remembering Julian's promise to build, to grow, to trust the stretch between them. Instead of calling, she wrote. Not messages, but letters, longhand on thick paper, detailing her discoveries, her frustrations, her small triumphs. She wrote about the way the light fell through stained glass in a forgotten chapel she'd catalogued, about the elderly curator who'd taught her to read watermarks by touch, about the loneliness that sometimes settled in her chest like fog. She sealed each letter without sending it, stacking them in a wooden box on her desk, a tangible accumulation of all the things she was saving for the moment they were no longer separated by distance. The ritual became her anchor, a way of honoring both her independence and her connection. 3 months in, the test came. A crisis erupted at the London Initiative, a funding shortfall threatening to collapse a critical preservation project. Simultaneously, Julian faced a hostile takeover attempt from a rival conglomerate sensing vulnerability in his temporary distraction. They were miles apart, facing separate battles, and the old instinct to merge their struggles, to solve everything together in real time, pulled at them both. Zora stood in her office, staring at the budget projections, her fingers tightening around the edge of her desk. She could call him. He would wire the funds before she finished explaining the problem. It would be easy, safe, but it would also be a regression, a surrender of the autonomy she'd fought to claim. She chose instead to leverage the relationships she'd built in London, negotiating a partnership with a local university that secured alternative funding, while preserving the project's integrity. It took 72 sleepless hours. When it was done, She sat in the quiet aftermath, exhausted and exhilarated, and wrote him a letter describing not the crisis, but the solution. On his end, Julian faced the takeover bid with a strategy Zora would have recognized. Meticulous research, strategic alliances, and unwavering ethical clarity. He didn't retaliate with aggression. He countered with transparency, releasing audited records that exposed the rivals' predatory tactics. The board rallied behind him, not because he commanded loyalty, but because he embodied the values Zora had helped embed in the company's foundation. When the threat dissolved, he didn't celebrate. He went to the archive, sat in her chair, and read her latest unsent letter, which had arrived that morning, delayed by postal service, describing her victory in London. He held the paper against his chest, feeling the echo of her resilience across continents. They had faced their trials separately and emerged stronger, not despite the distance, but because of it. If you've ever loved someone enough to let them fight their own battles, if you've ever trusted that separation can be a form of solidarity, then this moment is yours. Stay. Subscribe. Because the reunion will reveal whether two people who've grown apart can fit back together without losing what they've gained. The 6-month mark approached like a tide. Zora packed her flat with the same deliberate care she'd unpacked it, folding her new self alongside the old. Julian prepared the penthouse not as a shrine to her absence, but as a space ready to receive her wholeness. He cleared shelves for her London acquisitions, adjusted lighting to accommodate her changed rhythms, left the wooden box of unsent letters untouched on her desk, a silent acknowledgement of the inner world she'd cultivated beyond his reach. At the airport, their reunion was not the cinematic collision of bodies portrayed in films. It was quieter, deeper. They stood in the arrivals hall, taking each other in, mapping the subtle shifts. The new lines around her eyes from squinting at ancient manuscripts, the steadier set of his shoulders from carrying weight alone. No words were needed. Their hands found each other, fingers interlacing with the familiarity of homecoming and the novelty of rediscovery. In the car ride back, silence settled comfortably between them, charged with everything they'd become. When they reached the penthouse, Zora walked through the rooms, touching surfaces, absorbing the changes he'd made. She stopped at her desk, saw the box of letters, and turned to him. "You didn't read them," she said. It wasn't a question. He shook his head. "They weren't mine to read until you were here to share them." She opened the box, drew out the top letter, and handed it to him. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning her handwriting, his expression shifting as he absorbed not just the words, but the woman who had written them. When he looked up, his gaze was raw with recognition. "You're different," he whispered. She smiled, stepping closer. "So are you." The kiss that followed was a conversation between strangers who knew each other intimately, a negotiation of new boundaries and old devotions. It was slower, more exploratory, honoring the space they'd created and the closeness they were rebuilding. Later, tangled in sheets that smelled of sandalwood and jasmine, they talked. Not about logistics or plans, but about the texture of their transformation. About the loneliness that had sharpened their appreciation for presence. About the pride they felt in each other's independent victories. About the fear that had lived beneath the trust, and how it had been transmuted into something stronger. Julian traced the ink on his own forearm, then hers, where a faint scar from a paper cut in the London archive had healed into a silver line. "We're not the same people who said goodbye," he murmured. She rested her head on his chest, listening to the heartbeat that had anchored her across oceans. "No," she agreed, "we're better." And in that word was the culmination of everything they'd endured. The understanding that love is not a static state, but a continuous act of becoming. That true intimacy requires the courage to change, and the faith that change will lead you back to each other, again and again in new and deeper ways. The city lights glittered below, indifferent to the quiet revolution unfolding 60 stories above. But in the sanctuary they'd rebuilt, two people held each other, no longer defined by what they'd survived, but by what they were still choosing to create. Together, always together, evolving, enduring, alive. The morning after their reunion did not bring a grand epiphany or a cinematic declaration, but something far more enduring. The quiet rhythm of two lives choosing each other in the ordinary. Julian woke first, as he always had, but now his first conscious thought was not of schedules or strategies, but of the weight of Zora's head on his chest, the steady cadence of her breath syncing with his own. He lay still, memorizing the sensation, letting it settle into the spaces that distance had carved. When she stirred, blinking awake with sleep-softened eyes, there was no performative greeting, only a slow smile that held all the miles between them and all the closeness they'd reclaimed. She traced the line of his jaw, her touch lighter now, more assured, as if her hands had learned a new language in his absence. "You feel different," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. He caught her hand, pressed a kiss to her palm. "So do you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything unsaid. I see you. I honor who you've become. I am here for this version of you, not just the memory of who you were. They moved through the day without agenda, rediscovering the domestic intimacy that had been stretched across continents. She unpacked her London acquisitions, fragile manuscripts, pressed flowers from Hampstead Heath, a ceramic mug chipped from daily use, and he watched, not as a curator assessing artifacts, but as a lover witnessing the tangible evidence of her becoming. When she placed the wooden box of unsent letters on the nightstand, he didn't reach for it. Instead, he pulled her into his lap on the window seat, wrapping his arms around her waist as they watched the city awaken below. "Read me one," he whispered against her temple. She chose a letter written during the funding crisis, her voice soft as she recounted the 72 sleepless hours, the doubt, the moment she'd chosen trust over rescue. He listened, his chin resting on her shoulder, his hands splayed across her stomach, anchoring her to the present even as her words traveled back to the past. When she finished, he turned her face toward his thumb brushing her cheekbone. "You were magnificent," he breathed. "Not you survived. Not I'm proud of you. Magnificent." A word that honored her agency, her brilliance, her wholeness. She leaned into his touch, her eyes glistening. "We both were." In that exchange was the true resolution. Not a return to what was, but an arrival at what could be. Their love had not been tested by distance. It had been refined by it. They had learned to hold space for each other's growth without fear of loss, to celebrate independence as an act of devotion, to understand that the deepest intimacy is not possession, but partnership in evolution. As dusk painted the skyline in hues of gold and violet, they stood together at the window, her back against his chest, his arms wrapped around her, his tattoos pressing against her skin like a second heartbeat. Below them, the city pulsed with countless stories of longing and loss and hard-won connection. Above them, the stars emerged, ancient and unwavering. "This is our beginning," Julian murmured, his voice vibrating through her ribs. "Not the end of a story, the start of a legacy." Zora covered his hands with hers, their fingers interlaced, the platinum band on her finger catching the last light. "A legacy built on truth," she affirmed. "On trust. On becoming." And in that moment, suspended between earth and sky, between past and future, they understood that their love was not a destination, but a practice. A daily choice to see, to honor, to grow. A commitment to hold space for each other's unfolding, even when the path diverged, especially when it converged anew. If this story has found you, if it has spoken to the part of you that believes love is not about finding someone who completes you, but someone who walks beside you as you complete yourself, then you are home. This is AMBW Romance Stories, where every tale is crafted not just to entertain, but to affirm that Black women deserve love that sees their fullness, that honors their strength, that celebrates their becoming. That Korean men can be tender and fierce, vulnerable and powerful. Their hearts as complex as the ink on their skin. That romance is not escapism, but reflection. A mirror held up to the beauty, the resilience, the radical possibility of loving and being loved in your entirety. You are not too much. You are not too little. You are exactly enough, and your story matters. So stay, subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because this channel is not just mine. It is ours. A sanctuary for hearts that refuse to shrink. for loves that refuse to settle, for souls that know true romance is not about perfection, but presence. Not about forever, but fidelity to the moment, to the person, to the endless, beautiful work of becoming together. Thank you for witnessing Julian and Zora. Thank you for trusting us with your time, your hope, your heart. This is only the beginning. More stories are coming. Deeper loves, truer connections, bolder affirmations. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join this community of dreamers and believers. Because at AMBW Romance Stories, we don't just tell love stories. We honor them. We live them. We are them. And so are you. Until next time, remember, you are worthy of a love that grows with you, that challenges you, that chooses you again and again in every version of yourself. Stay bold. Stay tender. Stay true. This is AMBW Romance Stories. And your story is just beginning.